My name is Jarrod Tanny. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I also hold the Block Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies at UNC Wilmington. I arrived at this topic in a really strange way, because when I started out studying Russia and the Soviet Union as an undergraduate, I became very interested in Soviet nationality policy, national minorities, the explosion of ethnic conflict throughout the former Soviet Union. This was the early 90s at the time, so nationalism was very much on the horizon of scholars, and I took a wonderful political science course looking at the politics of the former Soviet republics. So when I went to graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on an ethnic minority or various ethnic minorities and how that intersected with Soviet nationality policy in graduate school. So I went to Berkeley to work with Yuri Slezkin and Reggie Zelnick, and Yuri was considered at the time one of the leading specialists in this area on studying nationalism and ethnicity in the former Soviet Union. And I actually thought I was going to work on the Caucasus region. I'd planned on working on Georgia for my dissertation, but after a failed attempt to learn the Georgian language, which is not related to any known language in the world, except for some other barely spoken languages from the Caucasus, I decided that wasn't a good idea, and I came to the conclusion that focusing on Soviet Jewish history was far more logical, because I grew up in a Jewish household. I went to Jewish day school for 12 years, and that gave me, enough of a knowledge of Hebrew combined with my fluency in Russian and the few years of German I took to know that learning Yiddish would not be that difficult, or it wouldn't be more difficult than learning Georgian was. So I wanted to work on a Soviet Jewish-related topic, and Yuri eventually, after we were running through a few different topics, he suggested that I work on Odessa, and that I look at the Jewish gangsters in particular from Odessa, because Odessa was famous for its Jewish gangsters, in part because of the stories that Исаак Бабель wrote. His famous Odessa stories purportedly document the escapades of these authentic Jewish gangsters who actually lived there. And I was very familiar with Babel. I'd written a paper on him while I was doing my master's degree. I spent some time in Odessa the first time I traveled through the former Soviet Union in 1994, just a few days in Kiev, a few days in Odessa, a few days in Lviv. And I knew Odessa was a lovely place in many respects, and I thought that sounded like a really terrific topic to work on. And the more I started to explore the history of the Jewish gangsters, I realized that there was a bit of a problem, that trying to write some sort of social history of the Jewish gangsters around the time of the revolutions, I knew I was going to run into a problem. And I had a conversation with one of my advisors, John Efron, who is my Jewish history advisor. And he said, well, what makes these guys Jewish? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they grew up in Jewish households. I mean, that's clear enough. But then they became criminals. Is there anything Jewish about their criminality, or are they just gangsters who happen to be of, Jewish descent? And I said, that's a very, very important point, and I don't want to start reading Jewishness where Jewishness does not actually exist. So I knew approaching it as a social history was going to be a little bit problematic. But the more memoirs I read and the more newspapers I was able to get my hands on, I began to realize that there was something really bigger here to talk about. And that's what I call, and I'm certainly not the first one to call it this, the myth of Old Odessa. That is to say, how Odessa has been commemorated, celebrated, and vilified by the many people who have traveled there, who were born there, who observed the place, who participated in the culture of the place. So I realized that it's not so much the reality itself that is fundamental here. Of course, reality is important, and I wanted to explore the reality in as much as possible. But I realized that all these people who were purporting to talk about the reality of Odessa shared a great deal in common with the people who were writing these allegedly fictional accounts about Odessa, like Исаак Бабель. And they were all engaged in the same discourse. They were all perpetuating what I call the myth of Old Odessa, which I argue in my work is a Jewish city of sin, or I use the term a Judeo kleptocracy. That is to say, a city that was overrun and governed by Jewish gangsters. It was vilified and it was celebrated as a Jewish city of sin. So it was seen by some as heaven, it was seen by others as hell on earth, but it was seen as a town of irreverent Jews, people who were not only criminal by inclination, but they were also comedians, and they were also great musicians. So it was a city of sin, much as New Orleans is celebrated as a city of sin in the United States, or vilified by certain people, much as San Francisco during the Gold Rush era was seen as this frontier boomtown where anything is possible and people could go there and make a fortune and have a great time. But they're going to get involved with very unsavory types. It shared a great deal with a place like Shanghai, which during the height of the opium trade was also one of these cities of sin. And people went there and they were drawn there. And very often they left there, bitter and distraught because they were either going to get robbed or things were going to turn out badly. And, I'll never forget my first conversation upon arriving in Ukraine in 2005 to do research. And my wife and I got off the plane in Kiev, and we get into the taxi. And I tell the taxi driver that we're headed down to Odessa in a few days. And he said, "Oh, Odessa, you're going to have a great time, but, keep your wallet in your front shirt pocket because it's going to be gone within a matter of hours." But he was saying it in a funny manner, saying you're going to get robbed there, but you're going to have a great time. So it had this New Orleans type of atmosphere to it. So, and I discovered this the more that I started reading things that people wrote Odessa. And I realized that this was something that had been developing throughout Odessa's entire history, that people had started mythologizing the town in this sort of way, literally, within a few years of Catherine the Great founding the city in 1794. And it perpetuated not only through the Soviet period, but right into the post-Soviet period, which is why my book actually covers Odessa's entire history, from the late 1700s right up until literally 2005, the day I got on the plane and came home. And that through the various different eras of that approximately 2 centuries, the celebration or the mythologization of Odessa had some consistency, but it evolved over time, depending on the particular historical context, depending on the people who were in power at that particular moment, depending on the demography of the city, which eventually became disproportionately Jewish, but that didn't happen until the mid to late 1800s. And then it had to deal with the assaults unleashed by the Soviet government because they did not believe that the celebration of a Jewish city of sin was acceptable in a proletarian society where they had to celebrate hard work and solemnity and fun, but in a very controlled manner. And into the post-Soviet period where the myth of Odessa today is on display everywhere because Odessa's post-Soviet leaders realize that this is great for tourism, much as people in New Orleans realize this as well. They want to sell their city, and they want people to come, so they're going to celebrate these gangsters and unsavory types of the past. So my book traces the history of this myth. And, the key element in what makes this a Jewish history account is that the myth eventually became intertwined with Jewish history because it became celebrated as a Jewish city of sin. It didn't start out that way. At first, it was just your typical frontier town, which had these attributes of places like San Francisco and New Orleans and Shanghai, with a very exotic cosmopolitan population, as all frontier seaport boom towns do. They attract people from all over the world, a particular type of person perhaps, but certainly diverse, ethnically speaking. And in Odessa's early days, it was populated mostly by Italians, by Greeks, by some Ukrainians, by some Russians, but people who were young, adventurous, who were taking up Catherine the Great's author to lessen the strictures of what was an authoritarian, autocratic state at the time. People were guaranteed more freedom of movement. Peasants who made their escape and ran away from their landlords and made it to Odessa or to the region of New Russia in general were guaranteed their liberty. So it was going to attract people who wanted a fresh start, people who wanted to make easy money quickly, people who were searching, for a good time. So sailors, and of course with sailors comes prostitutes and brothels and musicians and all sorts of other things that we associate with that. And of course the Jews were attracted to this as well. So by the second quarter of the 19th century, Jewish people started to come in large numbers. And by the time we get to the 1870s or the 1880s, the population is 1/3 Jewish. And because of that, Odessa not only is known as a Jewish city or as a city of sin, but it is also known as a Jewish city of sin. In the same way that New York became known as a Jewish city in the late 19th and early 20th century, because the Jews for New York, for much of New York's history in the late 1800s and early 1900s, were the largest ethno-religious community living in New York at the time. They weren't the majority by any means, and in Odessa they weren't the majority either. They were making up 33%. There were still more Russians, ethnic Russians in Odessa than Jews. But the interesting thing in this sense, and this is why I argue in my work that Odessa has more in common with New York than it does with the other cities in the Pale of Settlement, which had a dominantly Jewish population. Places like Minsk, places like Kishinev, they're not in Ukraine, but they're part of the Pale of Settlement. Places like Kiev, which had severe restrictions on Jewish residency, but eventually it did become a Jewish city of sorts with a major Jewish population. And Warsaw, of course, where the population was also 33% Jewish. But Odessa was different because it was a frontier boomtown that before being founded by Catherine the Great did not have a titular nationality that lived there. There was no ethnic group that would call that particular area its home. There was a small village there called Hadzibe, which was a Turkish village, so it was a Turkish trading outpost. And not many people lived there, and when Russia lost it to Turkey, from Turkey, and Russia gained it from Turkey, their goal was to populate it with anyone who wanted to settle there. So the way I argue it in my work is that Odessa could be called a Jewish city in such a way that a place like Warsaw or Kiev never could, for the simple fact that Warsaw and Kiev were considered cities that were the historic homeland of other ethno-national communities. Warsaw was a Polish city, even if ethnic Poles were barely the majority of the population in the late 1800s. It was the capital of Poland before it was partitioned. It was the envisioned capital of a resurrected Polish state, and it was one of the most important centers of Polish culture. Ukraine, Kiev, fulfills that function. Even though there hadn't been what one may call a Ukrainian state since medieval times, Kiev was still considered to be the epicenter in many respects of the Ukrainian national movement and of Ukrainian life. And of course, Kiev is the capital of Ukraine today. So even though it is a city for much of its history that was multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan in certain respects, with ethnic groups living, in friction at times, but in harmony at other times, it's still ultimately considered to be a Ukrainian city. Whereas Odessa did not have that situation. Even though it's located in Ukraine, it was by no means a Ukrainian city. The population of Ukrainians that lived there was never significant, at least not until the Soviet period, until the 1930s. The titular language spoken in Odessa was never Ukrainian, and it was really not until the post-Soviet period where you actually start hearing Ukrainian in the streets in any significant measure. But even when I was there in 2005, and it was really a bizarre situation because if you go everywhere, the signs are in Ukrainian, the Ukrainian language, but when you walk around in the streets, everyone is still speaking Russian. So it was, in certain respects, linguistically a Russian city. But here's where the Jewish element comes in. It wasn't a historic homeland of the Russian people either, because it was not part of the core historical territory of Russia. History was tied to the Black Sea region, to Turkey, and to the various powers that had colonized the Black Sea region over the many, many centuries, going all the way back to ancient Greek times. So in this sense, the dominant language spoken there was Russian. Russians did make up about 45% of the population, and then the Jews were second with 33%. But if you listen to the Russian spoken there at any period in time, beginning in the late 1800s, or if you read it the way it's been transcribed in newspapers and memoirs and in literature, it's a Russian that is heavily inflected with foreign languages, right? Not only in terms of the vocabulary that is used, but the sentence structure as well. So I could read a sentence spoken by someone of indeterminate ethnic origin in Odessa, and I could read what they're saying in a book written in the early 20th century, and I could recognize that the syntax very much has a Yiddish syntax to it. The way that the words are placed in certain orders, the choice of use of certain words, the utterly incorrect verb conjugations, which seem to reflect more the conjugations of Yiddish grammar than they do Russian grammar. And it's not just Yiddish. I mean, you get Italian and Greek and Ukrainian infusing and affecting the way the Russian is spoken as well. And here again, New York is a great comparison, because when you listen to the English spoken in New York, even today, but today it's diffused to the rest of the United States, but go back to the 1950s, and you listen to the English spoken in New York, and it's not just the accent, it's the sentence structure. It has this foreign element to it, and a great deal of that foreign element comes from the Jews. Not just the Jews, also the Irish and the Italians and other groups who settled in New York. But Jewishness is key here in the way that English is spoken there. So you have that interesting parallel, and it shows you how Jewishness can influence the culture of a region simply by the way the language is spoken, without any obvious markers of Jewishness, unless you're able to look for it. Well, in this case, I use the term Russia's Jews because for the city's founding and for most of its history, or until the Russian Revolution, we were dealing with an autocratic Russian state. The concept of Ukraine was an intellectual and a cultural construct among many Ukrainian nationalists and perhaps a lot of Ukrainian people in general and other people who inhabited that region. But of course, the Russian government did not treat the Ukrainian as an ethno-national community until the revolution, until the Bolsheviks and their nationality policy carved out a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So in this sense, given that in the imperial period, the Jews of Russia were confined to the Pale of Settlement, the overwhelming majority of the Jews who lived in the Russian Empire lived in the Pale of Settlement. And they didn't necessarily think of themselves as Ukrainian Jews. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as Russian Jews, mind you, either. And in many respects, the demographic map that Jews in that region were working with in their minds was a map drawn in the 15th and 16th centuries. So Jews would call themselves Polacks if they were from the region that was Poland going back to medieval times. They would call themselves Litvaks if they were from the region that was Lithuania, which of course is much larger than the Lithuanian state today. It includes large swaths of Belarusia and even Ukraine to a certain extent. Galicianers were Jews from the region of Galicia, which, of course, was mostly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. So Russia, in this sense, I could say there's two reasons for using the word Russia. One is the one I just mentioned because of its place in the Russian Empire. And administratively speaking, when the area of New Russia was carved out after the founding, or around the time of the founding of the city of Odessa, when that land was conquered by the Turks, it was called New Russia, right? The Russian government did not see it as being in any way territorially connected necessarily to Ukraine, to ethnic Ukraine. Of course, it was geographically connected. Of course, it was economically connected. Obviously, the lucrative grain trade of the Russian Empire made this connected to the regions around Kiev and the other parts that were considered the breadbasket of Europe at the time. So, yes, it was, of course, connected in the empire, but to Ukraine. But the imperial government's geopolitical map at the time designated this region as New Russia, and it was not necessarily seen as something that was one and the same as Ukraine itself. Now, the other reason, which I think is important too, is because after the revolution, a lot of the Jews who were in Ukraine, Ukraine in general, but in Odessa as well, and this is what I focus on in my book, a lot of them left Odessa to go to the Russian SSR because that was outside of the Pale, what had once been the Pale of Settlement. They'd been denied access to that place in the imperial period, and they wanted to go for the opportunities that were available in Moscow and in Kiev, Moscow, Petersburg, Leningrad, and the other major cities of the Soviet Union. So their destination was Russia. So they clearly saw themselves as being, Russian in that Rossiyski, that all-union sense of Russia, not Ruski, the ethnic Russian sense. Oh, yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't disagree with you there. Of course, during, the golden age of Poland, they call it in the 15 and 1600s, the Jews were integral, as you know, to the economy of the Polish Commonwealth, and they were the middlemen between the nobility and the peasants in that region around Kiev. And a lot of times, yes, they got along very well. A lot of times there was friction, as in the time of the Schnorrers uprisings and when there were a lot of Jews who were massacred. So Ukrainian-Jewish relations, they're fraught with conflicts, but obviously long stretches of time where they had to get along with each other because they worked together. The extent to which their cultures affected each other. It's interesting, if you read Yiddish literature from the late 1800s by Sholem Aleichem and Mendel and Mocher Sporim and these other great Yiddish writers, there are a lot of Slavic words that had found their way into the Yiddish language by that time period. Now, figuring out whether those words are by origin Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian, but for the most part it would be Polish or Ukrainian, that's also a very complicated question, and linguists argue it all the time. A schnorrer is a wonderful word, and I was so happy my advisor let me use it in my dissertation, and Indiana University Press allowed me to use it in the title of the book. A schnorrer is the Jewish word for a mooch, all right, someone who mooches off of other people. But it has a special connotation in the Yiddish language, and it's certainly carried over to Jews speaking English in the United States. And it's because historically there was this whole group of people, especially in the Pale of Settlement, where earning a living for a Jew became incredibly difficult in Tsarist times. And they would go around and they would essentially claim their entitlement to the charity of others. And they would say, you owe me a living because I am poor. And the logic behind it was that giving charity is, not simply a good act. It's considered what Jews call a mitzvah. It's something that's a commandment by God. You are supposed to help those who are unfortunate. And a lot of Jewish people who were more inclined towards, I don't want to call them swindlers outright, but they were people who wanted to linguistically manipulate their way into claiming that people had to take care of them. They would go around and they would say, well, it's your obligation to support me. So what if you happen to have a bad week economically last week? How does that affect me? I didn't have a bad week. Why should I suffer for it? So they're always highlighting their own suffering and trying to make the other person feel guilty as having been responsible for that suffering that they're enduring. And I found it a great word in the Odessa context because it captures that gray area between being an outright criminal and being someone who is basically a law-abiding, upstanding citizens, because they would look for all sorts of schemes to acquire wealth. I don't know if you're familiar with the Soviet novels by Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov, The 12 Chairs, and The Little Golden Cat. It tracks the escapades of this swindler who never claims to be Jewish in the book. He claims to be actually a son of a Turkish citizen. He claims to be descendant of the Turkish Janissaries. But his name is Ostap Bender, and that is obviously a Jewish name from the Pale of Settlement. And he travels around the Soviet Union basically trying to come up with these schemes and saying that, he's being screwed over by socialism and, he had no interest in living under socialism and he's being forced to this. So he's finding all these other shady characters in the Soviet Union, people who are hoarding wealth they had held over from the imperial period or perhaps acquired it through illicit means. And he's coming up with all these means of, these schemes in order to acquire wealth from these people. And he usually does it by convincing them through linguistic manipulation, as I call it, by claiming that it is his right to it. The Schnorrer was made famous, I think, in the wider non-Jewish world by Sigmund Freud in his famous book, Jokes and Their Relations to the Unconscious. And he talks about Jewish humor a great deal in that work. And every time he gives an example of a Jewish joke, he uses a joke about a Schnorrer. Schnorrers were among his favorite jokes, and because of that, the idea that somehow the Schnorrer is a foundational concept in Jewish humor has become popularized in the 20th century. Now, whether that's true or not in the 1800s is hard to say, because it might just be in the fanciful mind of Sigmund Freud. He might be the one responsible for having popularized this. But the idea became inextricably linked to Jewish culture and the wider culture for those who know about Jewish culture after that point. So with my title, to get back to that, City of Rogues and Schnorrers, yeah, the people are rogues, they're criminals, they're people who are searching for a good time and easy money down in Odessa, but they're also Schnorrers, and they're trying to find some way to ease themselves into the wealth of the city. And using the Yiddish word suggests that there's something Jewish about the city. Film-wise, it's interesting because during the Soviet period, you couldn't do this for obvious reasons because of censorship. And when they did let a few films slip by in that way, they would make it clear that this was the imperial period and the Soviet morality and Soviet communism, which gave a living to everyone, came and did away with this old life. But they would still try to capture the humor of the place in it as well. So you had the occasional film where Jewish gangsters would make a brief appearance in it, especially even in the 1920s. Like there was a movie called Benya Krik based on Isaac Babel's stories, a silent film from 1926, and that does have Jewishness and gangsterism right on display. The filmmaker took a lot of liberties in terms of interpreting Isaac Babel's stories. But once you get into the Stalin era, obviously that became a bit of a problem, and there was a movie made called Intervention. It was made in the mid to late 1960s, and it's based on a play by Lev Slavyn, which was written in 1933, I believe. But the movie was too explicitly Jewish, too explicitly gangster-driven, and it was not released in the Soviet period in the end. So that is Odessa brushing up against the limits of censorship. But since the late 1980s, there have been at least 3 films that have portrayed Isaac Babel's Jewish gangsters, so situated in the late imperial, early Soviet period. I've seen 2 or 3 of them, and they're not great films by any means whatsoever. But it is the first time since the 1920s where you could have explicitly Jewish gangsters on screen. One of them is called Bindyuzhniki Karol, the Carter and the King. A carter being someone who would deliver, a typical Luftmann, someone who lived on air, who would be making deliveries for people just trying to eke out an existence. And the king is a reference to Исаак Babel's main Jewish gangster, Benya Krik, who was considered the king of Odessa. But even there, a funny story connected with that, who knows if this is apocryphal or not, but I read it in a book of this guy's memoirs. He apparently, the guy who wrote the script for the film, he wrote it in the mid-1980s when Perestroika was just starting out. He didn't hear back from anyone for about 2 or 3 years, and he eventually got a phone call of 1988-ish. And they said, yeah, we do want to produce your movie, but there's a bit of a problem here. And he said, what? He said, well, do they have to be Jewish, the gangsters? And he said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we can't really talk about that stuff in public. It was still the Soviet period, so you couldn't really talk about a lot of Jewish things. Can't you make them a different nationality? And he's saying, well, they're Исаак Babel's Jewish gangster characters. I can't change their nationality. I can't change their ethnic identity. And he said, well, how about this? It takes place in the Moldavanka region of Odessa. There was a region called the Moldavanka. Why not make them Moldovan? Pretend that they're Moldovan, who are, of course, the people related to the Romanians. So this utterly absurd rescripting of Jews because you couldn't have Jewish gangsters on screen. But in the end, 1989 comes around, censorship has, for all intents and purposes, disappeared, and the movie was with explicitly Jewish gangsters. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I haven't necessarily seen all of these, but there have been many serializations, dramatizations of gangsters from Odessa that have been shown on Odessan TV. This was done in the early 2000s. There was a whole series of books put out by these two guys called Banditskaya Odessa, chronicling the alleged history of the gangsters of Odessa. And yes, it reads like The Sopranos. And I don't doubt that at least half of what's in that book is fictional and not real. So it is happening. And whether the film industry has really done as much as, or the TV industry has done as much as the United States, I think that has more to do with the robustity and the longevity of American, Hollywood compared to the Soviet or post-Soviet one. Yes, what I found interesting is the way that Soviet censorship functioned at different levels, and depending not only on the time period, but also on the medium being employed and the region in which the medium was being developed. Because, people tend to view the Soviet Union as one homogenous lump where you had the dictates of the proletarian government telling you what you were allowed to do culturally and what you were not allowed to do culturally. And, of course, all us historians, know that this would vary from the 1920s to the Stalin era to the post-Stalin era. But, the standard for Soviet Jewish culture was that until the late Stalin era, you were allowed to be explicitly Jewish in the Soviet Union, culturally speaking, not theologically speaking, because religion was basically banned. So there was space for Jewish culture right up into the 1930s. But once Stalin launched the anti-cosmopolitan campaign in the mid to late 1940s, anti-Semitism became the order of the day. Certainly different from Nazi anti-Semitism. It manifested itself in very different ways. And Stalin's death in 1953 preempted any sort of massive purge of the Jewish people. But from 1953 until the mid to late 1980s, you couldn't really be Jewish in public in the Soviet Union. You could only do it in very constrained ways. So you couldn't have explicitly Jewish films. You couldn't have explicitly Jewish novels, except for certain classics that had been written perhaps in the 1920s or in the late 1800s. People were not writing new ones in that sense. And there's a very famous, can I tell a joke, a very famous Odessa or Jewish joke from the Soviet Union? Well, actually, this isn't a dirty joke at all, but it does capture the place of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union celebrated itself as as for the brotherhood of nations and how they allowed ethnic identities to be cultivated. And some musicians or musical directors, some prominent musicians from the United States, come on a cultural tour of the Soviet Union, and the director of the Moscow Orchestra is proud of his musicians. He's introducing them. He wants to show what a great multi-ethnic orchestra he has. And he says, over here, we have Ivanov. He's a Russian. Over here, we have Kernyenko. He's a Ukrainian. Over there, we have Gomiashvili. He's a Georgian. And over there, we have Rabinovich. He's a violinist. So, you see, it gets to the heart of it where, we can't mention Jewish people in the Soviet Union, even though we know they're there. But the irony here, of course, is that, of course, Rabinovich is a Jewish name. No one's going to doubt that. It has to be a Jewish name. And violin became one of these markers, one of these code words for being Jewish, because the Jews were heavily associated with that instrument. So the people hearing the joke, will get the double coding of it. They will understand it, and they will understand the irony of the Soviet Union having so many prominent Jews culturally, but at the same time, you couldn't really talk about it. So what I was looking for here, and this is what I found really fascinating, was that in many ways the word Odessit, an Odessan in the Russian language, became code word for a Jewish person in the Soviet Union, and a particular type of Jewish person, one who was a rogue and a Schnorrer. So when you see the word Odessit come up in so many of these accounts that I'd be reading, some of them written in the Soviet period too, because they couldn't talk about things explicitly Jewish. I knew they were referencing Jewish things. And these are things written by Jews in a very positive light, and they were also things written by some non-Jews who were very anti-Semitic, and you'd see them describing the Odessan in very anti-Semitic stereotypes, all without ever using the word Jew. So I would see this the way the Jews found themselves depicted in Soviet culture through certain code words. Just to give you one example, Leonid Utyosov. And he's a great, do you know who he is, Leonid Utyosov? He was a Soviet jazz musician who came from Odessa originally, and, like Исаак Бабель, they started their careers in Odessa before the revolution, but they made their way to Moscow and Petersburg after the revolution. But whereas Babel perished during the purges, Leonid Utyosov went on to be one of the most acclaimed Soviet jazz musicians. And, his entire mobility and his career, he owed everything he had to the Soviet Union, and he was a loyal Soviet citizen. But what was he producing? Well, in the 1920s, he was recording songs about Jewish gangsters from Odessa. And they were clearly Jewish songs because they had klezmer inflection to it. The melodies were clearly taken from Jewish music. And you see here the influence of Jewish improvisational music on Soviet jazz music. After 1929, he wasn't allowed to record them anymore because you're in the Stalinist era and you have culture constrained in certain ways. But he found other ways to get his message about the culture of Odessa and the Jewishness of Odessa out there. And he did this through his memoirs, and he wrote several memoirs, and each of them became increasingly Jewish, even though the words Jew would be used less and less, fewer and fewer times, as the years progressed. So his final volume, which I believe was written in 1976, and, in the Soviet Union, 1976 is considered to be the cultural low point. It's the height of the Brezhnev era. You have this man who's being propped up, this old man being propped up as general secretary who could barely repeat his official Soviet line about how this is a great nation and all that. And it's considered to be culturally stagnant. But here we have Leonid Utyosov writing a novel in Russian, but basically writing in Yiddish, right? It's Russian with the Yiddish inflection. He's telling stories about the unsavory yet entertaining types he encountered in the Odessa of his youth. And a lot of them are gangsters and criminals. And he goes on about what a great place this was because of, the spontaneity and the culture and the cosmopolitanism. And he's doing all this without using the word Jewish, not even once, right? But every time he would say the word Odessit, he is referring to a Jewish person or to Jewishness. It really depends on who's doing the writing and the talking, right? And Leonid Utyosov is a great example because he is someone who celebrates the city and celebrates these things, but at the same time, he was working within the Soviet system, and he probably sincerely believed that the Soviet Union was a great place, and he had no problem with it. So he is, saying these things with pride, and he's thrilled to have come from this culture. He's thrilled to have attended the great speech when Mishka Yaponchik, Mike the Jap, the gangster upon whom Исаак Бабель based Benya Krik, allegedly based Benya Krik, his main gangster. Mishka Yaponchik, the story goes, that when the Soviets finally took over Odessa, and he was basically running the town before that, he marched into the commandant's office and said, "We are prepared to fight for Soviet power. We have weapons, we have everything I need. Let us march under the Soviet flag. Promise not to do away with our gangsters. Let us, go and we will defend Soviet power. And if we, pinch a little from the bourgeoisie for ourselves, please, look the other way. We have to sustain living." So, and of course, what ended up happening is when they were sent off into battle at the first encounter of the white troops, or I think there might have been some of the Ukrainian nationalists perhaps, they dropped their weapons and they fled. So they ended up being cowards and they ended up fleeing and going back to Odessa to continue with their former ways. But Utyosov writes about these guys in his memoirs as if they were, of course, these are bad men and they're criminals and this and that, and there's no place for them in the Soviet future. But at the same time, there's something alluring about them. And Utyosov was talking about, yeah, sure, we musicians hung out with these guys. When Yaponchik gave his great big speech about how he's he's ready to join and fight for the Soviet Union, he said all the entertainers of Odessa went to go listen to him speak. I mean, try and imagine such a scenario in the States. Okay, you have Tony Soprano giving a speech how he's, going to go off to Iraq and fight for the American government, and then all of Hollywood comes to listen to this Jewish gangster or Al Capone or whoever, or this gangster to speak and to give his speech. So it's really very bizarre if you think about it. So, yeah, I think for a lot of these guys, the ones who are making the city popular, they're taking a certain pride of ownership in it. Like, they're happy to have come from that culture. I would say it's muted by the myth of Old Odessa. Whether scholars have muted it or not, that's a different story. A responsible scholar would not be muting that. He wouldn't do that. And again, I'm writing about the myth, not about the reality. But in that chapter and in the previous chapter, when I look at the late imperial period, I do to a certain extent look at what was actually going on. So I did work in the archive in Odessa, and I looked at criminal reports compiled by policemen, police officials, as well as the judiciary. And of course, whatever journalistic accounts found their way into the newspapers. But with newspapers, you do have that added layer where everyone's playing up the myth in certain respects. Like they're engaged in myth making too. Now, what I would say though about Jewish gangsters though is that, and this is true of the United States as well, and I think it would be true of Jewish gangsters in the Ashkenazi world in general. Jews tended to be involved in white-collar crimes rather than in violent crimes. Now, of course, we all know about Meyer Lansky and these very famous Jewish gangsters who were part of Murder, Inc. But if you look demographically speaking, in terms of sheer numbers, the crimes that the Jews were involved in New York in the early 1900s, and this I believe is true for Odessa too, tended to be extortion rackets, which I don't mean to downplay the potential violence involved in extortion, but also in fraud. There's a lot of counterfeiting going on. Anything that involves international trade or even local trade with the bootlegging industry. Jews, and here's one where, of course, this is a really horrible industry. Jews played a very large role in the international prostitution trade. And this is something, yes, I would say at a certain generation, there were historians who would want to not talk about that, because it would lead to, they were scared of abetting anti-Semitism, so they'd be worried about it. But the international prostitution trade was a logical business for Jews to go into. They were multilingual. They were, by definition, a diasporic community who had connections in different countries, so it was very easy for them to set up these trading networks. They didn't have a problem with that. Being literate in multiple languages was to facilitate fraudulent travel documents for the very people to use. So there is a certain hush-hush about discussing that. And, but even in the newspapers in Odessa, it would come up. And the editors of these Russian-language newspapers were Jewish, so they certainly would have to worry about anti-Semitism. People would be downplaying things like that at certain points. But what's important to realize, too, I think, is also that the victims of these people in the prostitution trade were also Jewish, right? This wasn't, Jewish criminals who were trying to enslave non-Jewish women because they had some sort of Jewish agenda by any means whatsoever. The vast majority of the women who got sucked into this were Jewish as well. They were looking to get out of Russia, as millions of Jews were looking to get out of Russia. And sometimes they were getting duped into the international prostitution trade. They were promised a husband or a job or something in the New World, and they would find themselves either in New Orleans, but also in Constantinople or Buenos Aires, Rio, and various other destinations, and they would be, it's a familiar story. They'd be trapped in international prostitution. It'd be very hard to get out of it. So, yes, and if you want to stick with violence, just to go on with that, I can give you another example with the violence and how it's downplayed. And this is not necessarily being done because of fears of anti-Semitism. This would be the pogrom of 1905, which was the largest one to that point in the Imperial Russia. At least 400 were killed. I mean, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 only resulted in 49 deaths. So the Odessa pogrom was huge. And during the Great Patriotic War, during World War II, there were serious massacres of Jews, especially unleashed by the Romanians. I mean, the Odessa massacre was massive. And the only reason I think Odessa's Jewish population was able to survive was because the Romanians were so utterly inefficient at committing genocide compared to the Germans. Germany didn't occupy Odessa until the end of the war, and by that point, most of the Jews had fled out of the city. Now, here's the interesting thing. Why aren't people talking about these things when they're talking about the myth of old Odessa? This doesn't sound like a good time, right? I mean, this clearly sounds like there's ethnic tension there and there's ethnic friction. During my job interview at Ohio, the professor there whose specialty is World War II and so he asked me outright about, where's World War II in all this? I remember presenting a paper once and someone said, where's the pogrom in all this? Well, the myth makers chose not to really focus on these things because they wanted to remember the city and celebrate the city for certain things. And this included, the ethnic harmony that existed there because they created this culture of criminality, which had place for Jews and Ukrainians and Russians and Greeks and all these other groups. So yeah, I would definitely say there is a muting of this tendency. And I don't want to say historians are muting it because that's certainly not the case. I mean, now, at the risk of, of maligning, I don't mean to diss Ukrainian nationalists here, but one of the fascinating things about, Ukraine and Ukrainian history is the fact that you have the borders of the current Ukrainian state do not necessarily reflect the history of it, and especially the demographic history of it, right? I mean, you have Western Ukraine, whose history was not tied to Russia whatsoever, at least unless you go all the way back to the Middle Ages, and that has become a center point of Ukrainian nationalism for obvious reasons. You have Eastern Ukraine, whose history is much more tied to ethnic Russia than it is to ethnic Ukraine, at least until we get to the Soviet period. And the same thing is true with Odessa, right? Because in the imperial period, the ethnic Ukrainian population of Odessa was incredibly low. The Russians made up 46% of the population. Now, I don't doubt that within that 46% of the population that was Russian, some of those people were ethnic Ukrainians. If ethnic Ukrainians are going to come to a cosmopolitan seaport, they're not going to be Ukrainian nationalists, right? They're going to understand that language is a tool to get ahead, whether it's in a legitimate industry or an illegitimate industry, and Russian was the obvious language to use. So I don't doubt that the Ukrainian population might have been higher in the imperial period, but these weren't Ukrainian nationalists, right? These weren't people who were, going there. They might have had the mindset if they came from the rural countryside, but they weren't operating in the same context of Ukrainian peasants, Jewish women, Polish landlords, right? This is a very, very different historical context that we're operating in. So, again, that's why, the place of Odessa in Ukrainian history is a very, very complicated topic. But until we get to the Soviet period, it's not really part of Ukrainian history. I mean, that changes, of course, depending on how we define Ukraine, of course. It all depends on how you define the concept of Ukraine. But once you get to the Soviet period, it's in the Ukrainian SSR. You have Ukrainians coming down to Odessa at that point for the obvious reason that it's a city and it's a good place to look for work in the factories or wherever else. And it remained in Ukraine throughout the Soviet period, and it remains in Ukraine today. Now, what's interesting here, 2005, when I was there, it was right after the Orange Revolution. And it was interesting during the Orange Revolution to see the regional variation about who was really, actively participating in it and who wasn't, depending on, where they lived and the histories of those places. And when I got to Odessa, I asked them about it, and the attitude was, oh, yeah, all that stuff's going on in Kiev, whatever. We're Odessans. We're proud of our Odessan uniqueness, and we're going to go on like this. So, and I think this actually ties in a bit with downplaying the pogroms and those instances of violence. They don't want to see themselves to be caught up in this whole fray of the ethnic politics of the region. And this is true for any point in their history. Yes, there were instances like the pogroms when violence will break out. But, on the whole, that was not the case. That was happening, and they don't want to remember these political ethnic conflicts when they did actually take place. What happened in the more recent conflict in 2014, that I'm not sure about because I haven't spoken to anyone over there in a few years. And there was one moment of mass violence a couple of years ago when something happened in 2014. But beyond that, as near as I can tell, Odessa is trying to remain outside of the fray. They see themselves as a Russian or a Russophone city, but they don't necessarily see themselves attached to Russian politics. It's not like Eastern Ukraine in that sense. And I think that's one of the points I try to make in my book. By the time we get to the 1930s, the myth of Odessa has taken on a life of its own, and to a large extent, it operated independently of what the reality was. Just to give you an example, Nikolaev, which is not far from Odessa, is a hotbed of criminality too. And if you ask anyone, should I go to Nikolaev? They say, what, are you crazy? It's a shithole. Don't go there. No offense to your listeners who might be from Nikolaev. And they did have a large Jewish population too at one point. But the interesting thing is criminality might be, maybe it's just as bad in Odessa today as it is in Nikolaev. But people are still going to say, oh, Odessa, yeah, you got to go there, even because of the criminality. But no one would ever say that about Nikolaev. So in terms of criminality, once we get to the late Soviet period, these people were implicated in the Soviet system in really interesting and complicated ways. And then once we get to the post-Soviet era, where we have these so-called entrepreneurs who basically have become organized crime in this area. The extent to which it would be proliferating in Odessa and in eastern Ukraine, it's a very complicated question. And, I imagine there are a lot of matrices that are involved in it. But here, Odessa has this reputation, and I think the reputation is key. And I also think that the fact that they're willing to celebrate this reputation adds to it and makes it harder to disentangle from reality. Well, the one general point I would like to make is to underscore the heterogeneity of culture in the Russian Empire and even in the Soviet period. For long, people were saying nationalist in form, socialist in content. Meant fine. You got to say what you wanted to say in your native language, but that was it. I mean, you were still parroting what the Kremlin wanted to say. But it was far more complicated than that. And these people found ways to work in their indigenous, I don't like using the word indigenous, but let's just say their pre-Soviet cultures into the Soviet system in interesting and complicated ways. Now, there was a certain party line that they did need to follow, but there were certainly ways of manipulating it and of working your way through it. So I would say that this is something that applies to Jewish culture in the Soviet Union, but it applies to Ukrainian culture. It applies to the culture of the various peoples of Central Asia. There were, over 150 different ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, depending on which period you're looking at and depending on how ethnicity is defined. And so I want to underscore the fact that, you had cultural heterogeneity, and and this heterogeneous culture was not necessarily resistance either. Because a lot of people think if you're going to do something that is not specifically what the Kremlin wants, then you're resisting. It's not necessarily resistance. A lot of these guys saw themselves as being part of the Soviet system. They had no problem with it. They might have not been with their standard of living, and whatever else. But at the same time, they saw no contradiction in their minds with being able to try any way they can to celebrate the culture that they believe to be their own, because culture is always constructed and who knows where it originally came from, that they believe they inherited from their grandparents and their great-grandparents from pre-revolutionary times. And they believe that they could find a way to get it to proliferate in the Soviet Union. Not always successfully, but a lot of them did try and they did succeed to a certain extent. And this is something I meant to say before, and it was one of the surprises when I was looking through the local newspapers in Odessa, even in the 60s and the 70s, when you had the Kremlin really, keeping a tight leash on everything, and things had been homogenized by that point compared to the 1920s, you still found little cracks in the system where the Odessa myth and Jewishness was able to come out in these really, really boring, otherwise boring Soviet newspapers that talked about grain harvests and industrialization and all this other crap, that they're trying to celebrate the Soviet Union for, officially speaking. The journalists there, were aware that, they could find a little space in official publications if they tried to do it. And this doesn't necessarily mean they were resisting. They weren't engaged necessarily in an active resistance. They had no problem being Soviet citizens and in doing this as well. So those are categories that we have to really be careful with, looking at resistance versus complicity. There's a major gray area in between there that's important. The other important thing I want to stress, and this I imagine is also true of other nationalities in the Soviet Union, but I think is distinctive for the Jews to a certain extent, is the way a culture that emerges on the periphery of the Russian Empire could then go on and influence the cultural center of the Soviet Union. Because after the collapse of Imperial Russia, the Jews were granted the mobility to go around the Soviet Union wherever they wanted. Now, a lot of people have argued most of these, cultural ambassadors, these people who left the Pale of Settlement, not just Odessa, but other places, they wanted to become Russian. Their goal was to become Russian in every respect and to find their place in Russian culture and Russian politics, to basically assimilate. That's true for a lot of people, no question about it. But it's also true that a lot of them saw merit in the culture that they were bringing from Odessa to the center and from other places in the Pale, perhaps. And that's why you have people like Leonid Utyosov, who, even though they are very Soviet and very Russian in certain respects, they're still celebrating the culture from which they came. And they're doing it to a wider Soviet audience, right? People like Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov, who wrote those two books I mentioned, they're popularizing this Jewish swindler who is straight out of Odessa in terms of his demeanor and the way he acts in every respect. And these become among the most popular books in the Soviet Union. So culture in the Soviet Union did vary from region to region, but it's also important to see how the periphery did influence the center in many respects. And I think that's true with a lot of other countries. I think I can make the same argument regarding New York. If you look at the vaudeville culture that developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, with the Jews playing a very important role here. And then once Hollywood basically gets created in the 1920s, and you have the culture of New York starting to migrate outwards to the rest of the United States, you do find ethnicity or Jewishness specifically finding itself into the larger culture of America. Now, and this is another interesting thing regarding censorship. In the Soviet Union, there was censorship, so you can only be specifically Jewish or specifically ethnic in certain ways. The United States, that was no less true, especially during the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, during the era of nativization, when you would not find black people on television, where you could not have Jews, or in film, I should say, and then television. You could not have Jews or explicit Jews in films in the 1930s. They had to mute their identity. Whenever you needed an ethnic character who was probably Jewish in origin, they would mark him as an Italian rather than a Jew. But the irony here is there wasn't official censorship in the U.S. in the same way as there was in the Soviet Union, right? You didn't have the government cracking down on Hollywood. But it was self-censorship imposed by a lot of these Jewish people who actually owned these Hollywood studios, who came to believe that no one wanted to see Jewish people on TV. The cultural producers, the people who were writing the movies and then later on the TV shows, they found ways to put encoded Jewishness, to put implicit Jewishness into the material, much as they were doing in the Soviet Union in the Stalin era. So I think this raises an important question regarding mechanisms of censorship and how they work in these different contexts, one of them an authoritarian, one of them a democracy with freedom of the press. And you find similar patterns of what's being censored, but the process by which it occurs might be different. But you still find similar patterns. So in that sense, I guess the Soviet Union is more like the United States than people might want to admit. Okay, thank you. My pleasure. And I'll send you those images later today. Thank you so much.